The transport ship Meridian's Hope shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its massive hull groaning under the stress of the transition. Captain Elena Vasquez gripped the armrests of her command chair, watching the tactical display populate with red warning indicators. What should have been a routine supply run to the outer colonies had become something far more dangerous. "Captain, we're detecting multiple Zephyrian attack vessels," reported Lieutenant Commander Chen from the sensor station. "At least 12 destroyers and what looks like a battle cruiser. They're moving to intercept." Elena's jaw tightened. The Zephyrians had been pushing deeper into human territory for months, but this was the first time they'd been bold enough to attack a supply convoy this close to Earth. The Meridian's Hope carried medical supplies, food and equipment desperately needed by the frontier colonies. Losing this cargo would mean thousands of civilian deaths. "What's our escort situation?" she asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "2 frigates, the Perseus and Titan's Edge," Chen replied. "They're moving to defensive positions, but Captain, we're seriously outgunned." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Elena had served in the Colonial Defense Force for 15 years, working her way up from junior communications officer to commanding her own vessel. She'd seen combat before, but never against odds like these. 3 human ships against a Zephyrian strike force was barely a speed bump. "Captain," came a voice from the communication station, "the Perseus is requesting all available combat pilots report to the briefing deck. They're asking if we have anyone qualified for atmospheric combat operations." Elena almost laughed, but it came out as more of a bitter sound. The Meridian's Hope was a cargo hauler, not a warship. Her crew consisted of engineers, medics, supply specialists, and civilians. The idea that they might have combat pilots aboard was almost absurd. "Broadcast to all decks," she ordered. "Any personnel with military flight experience report to Deck 7 immediately. Any atmospheric combat experience, make it known." She didn't expect much response. Most of her crew were either too young to have seen the last major conflict, or too old to be relevant for modern combat systems. The few military veterans aboard were engineers or support staff, not pilots. The minutes ticked by as the Zephyrian ships closed distance. Elena watched the tactical display with growing dread. The enemy fleet was still hours away, but at their current speed they'd be in weapons range before any reinforcements could arrive. The 2 escort frigates were already calculating firing solutions, but their combined firepower wouldn't make a significant dent in the approaching force. "Captain," Lieutenant Torres called from the communications station, "we're getting responses from the pilot request. 3 people have reported to Deck 7. 3? Elena raised an eyebrow. That was more than she'd expected, but still nowhere near enough to make a difference. "What kind of experience are we talking about?" "The Perseus is conducting interviews now. 2 appear to be transport pilots with some basic combat training. The 3rd, Torres paused, consulting his display. "The 3rd is listed as having specialized atmospheric combat experience, but no other details." Elena nodded grimly. It wasn't much, but every pilot might make a difference. The frigates carried a small complement of fighter craft, designed primarily for escort duties and light reconnaissance. In a desperate situation, they might be able to provide some tactical advantage. The ship shuddered again as the engines adjusted course. Through the main viewport, Elena could see the distant dots of light that marked the Zephyrian fleet. They were coming fast, and they weren't showing any signs of slowing down or attempting communication. This wasn't a raid or a warning. This was an extermination mission. "Captain," Chen called out, his voice tight with stress, "I'm reading energy signatures from the Zephyrian ships. They're charging weapon systems. At this range?" Elena frowned. "They're still hours away from effective firing distance." "Yes, ma'am, but their battlecruiser is massive. If they're carrying long-range plasma cannons..." Chen's voice trailed off as the implications became clear. Elena felt her stomach drop. Long-range plasma cannons were devastating weapons, capable of crippling or destroying ships at distances far beyond normal combat range. If the Zephyrians had retrofitted their battlecruiser with such weapons, they could start picking apart the human convoy long before the frigates could return fire. "Get me Captain Morrison on the Perseus," she ordered. The screen flickered to life, showing the weathered face of Captain James Morrison. Behind him, Elena could see the controlled chaos of a warship preparing for battle. Morrison's expression was grim but determined. "Elena," he said without preamble, "I won't sugarcoat this. We're looking at a slaughter unless we can pull off something miraculous. What about those pilots? Any useful skills in the group? Morrison's expression shifted, becoming thoughtful. 2 are standard transport jockeys. Brave enough, but they'd be flying coffins against Zephyrian interceptors. The third one, he paused, glancing at something off-screen. The third one is interesting. Very quiet, very young. Claims to have specialized combat experience, but she's being evasive about the details. She? Yeah. Barely looks old enough to have a license, let alone combat experience. But there's something about her. The way she carries herself. The questions she's asking about our fighter capabilities. My flight commander thinks she might be the real deal. Helena considered this. In desperate times, even the slimmest hope was worth pursuing. What's her background? That's the odd thing. Her records show she's listed as a supply specialist, assigned to your ship 6 months ago. But when we asked about her flying experience, she just said she'd flown some difficult missions and asked if we had any Black Hawk variants in our fighter bay. Black Hawks? Elena's eyebrows shot up. Black Hawks were legendary Earth aircraft, used primarily in the most dangerous combat zones of the previous century. They'd been retired from active service decades ago, replaced by more advanced craft. Why would someone ask about such an old design unless— Captain, Torres interrupted urgently. The Zephyrian battlecruiser is firing. Elena's attention snapped back to the tactical display. Brilliant streaks of plasma were racing across space toward them. Still minutes away, but traveling at incredible speed. The die had been cast. In the next few hours, they would either find a way to survive this encounter, or they would become another casualty statistic in humanity's war for survival. As the first enemy plasma bolts closed distance, Elena found herself thinking about the mysterious young woman who'd asked about Blackhawks. Something told her that before this day was over, that quiet supply specialist might be the key to their survival. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the bulkhead of Deck 7, watching the chaos unfold around her. The Perseus flight deck buzzed with activity as mechanics frantically prepared every available fighter for launch. She'd been quiet during the interview with the flight commander, giving minimal answers about her experience. The truth was too complicated, and right now, complicated truths could get people killed. The other 2 pilot candidates stood nearby, both men in their 30s with the confident bearing of experienced transport pilots. They talked loudly about their flight hours and their willingness to die for the convoy. Sarah said nothing, instead studying the fighter craft being prepped for launch. The Perseus carried 12 Raptor-class interceptors, fast and maneuverable but lightly armed, good for reconnaissance and escort duties, but woefully inadequate against Zephyrian heavy fighters. The ship's complement also included 4 Falcon attack craft, more heavily armed but slower and less agile. Standard Colonial Defense Force equipment designed for known threats and conventional tactics. You're awfully quiet, said one of the transport pilots, a burly man named Davidson. Having second thoughts about volunteering? Sarah looked at him with dark, serious eyes. I'm thinking about how to keep us all alive. Davidson laughed. Kid, I appreciate the confidence, but this isn't a simulation. Those are real Zephyrian ships out there, and they've been killing human pilots for months. Experience matters. Before Sarah could respond, the flight commander approached. Commander Lisa Park was a veteran pilot herself, with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that came from years of combat experience. She looked tired, the weight of command visible in her posture. All right, people, Park announced. We've got maybe 2 hours before the Zephyrians are in optimal firing range. Our best tactical analysis suggests they'll try to disable our engines first, then systematically destroy the cargo vessels. Our job is to delay them long enough for reinforcements to arrive. What kind of reinforcements? Asked the second transport pilot, Miller. Park's expression darkened. That's classified, but let's just say help is coming. The question is whether we can hold out long enough. She turned to Sarah. Chen, you've been quiet during this whole briefing. I need to know right now what kind of experience you actually have. Lives depend on accurate information. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. The truth would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. But lies might get everyone killed. I flew combat missions in contested airspace, she said finally. Close air support, extraction operations, target elimination. High-risk, low-altitude work. Where? Park pressed. What unit? That's classified, Sarah replied, echoing Park's earlier words. Park studied her for a long moment. Something in Sarah's posture, the way she held herself, spoke of genuine combat experience. There was a stillness about her that veteran warriors recognized in each other. "The fighters we have available aren't atmosphere craft," Park said. "These are space interceptors. Different physics, different tactics." "I understand the difference," Sarah said quietly. "But flying is flying. Physics change, but the fundamentals don't. You read your environment, you adapt to your equipment, and you complete the mission." The ship shuddered as the first Zephyrian plasma bolts struck their shields. The lights flickered momentarily before stabilizing. Everyone on the flight deck felt the impact. "That's it," Park announced. "We're out of time for long conversations. Davidson Miller, you'll be flying wing positions in a standard defensive formation. Chen," she paused, making a decision that would haunt her regardless of the outcome. "You'll be flying solo reconnaissance. I want you to get close to their formation, identify their primary targets, and report back." Davidson started to protest. "Commander, putting the least experienced pilot on a solo mission is exactly what we're going to do," Park cut him off. "Chen, you'll be in Raptor 7. It's been modified with enhanced sensors and improved stealth capabilities. Your job is to survive long enough to give us tactical intelligence." Sarah nodded. "Understood." As the group dispersed to their assigned aircraft, Park caught Sarah's arm. "I don't know what your real story is," she said quietly, "but I've seen enough combat to recognize another warrior. Whatever classified unit you served with, I hope they taught you how to stay alive." "They did," Sarah replied. "But they also taught me that sometimes staying alive isn't the mission." Park released her arm, unsure whether to feel reassured or more worried than before. Sarah made her way to Raptor 7, running through pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. The cockpit was cramped compared to what she was used to, but the basic controls were intuitive enough. As she strapped herself in, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved across the console, configuring systems and reviewing tactical displays. The truth was that Sarah Chen had never flown a space interceptor before. She'd never even been off Earth until 6 months ago. But she had logged over 800 combat hours in the most dangerous aircraft ever built, in conditions that would have killed most pilots before they could even reach the cockpit. She'd been 22 when she'd first climbed into a Black Hawk helicopter in the mountains of Afghanistan. The year was 2019, and she was part of an elite unit that officially didn't exist. Night raids deep in hostile territory, extraction missions under fire, close air support for ground units that were supposed to have been evacuated hours earlier. For 3 years, she'd flown missions that pushed both human endurance and mechanical limits to their breaking points. She'd learned to fly in conditions where a single mistake meant death, not just for her but for the soldiers depending on her. She'd mastered the art of low-altitude flying through mountain valleys, while enemy forces fired everything they had at her aircraft. Then the accident happened, a routine extraction mission that went wrong when her helicopter was hit by enemy fire. The crash had killed her co-pilot and injured 2 of the soldiers she was extracting. Sarah had survived, but the investigation that followed revealed inconsistencies in her background that led to uncomfortable questions. Rather than face a court-martial for forged credentials, she'd accepted a quiet transfer to the Colonial Supply Service, a chance to disappear to start over. For 3 years, she'd been just another supply specialist, moving cargo between Earth and the outer colonies. But some skills never left you. And right now, Sarah Chen was preparing to fly into combat again, even if the cockpit was different and the sky was an endless void instead of mountain valleys. "Raptor 7, you are cleared for launch," came Park's voice over the comm system. Sarah engaged the launch sequence, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as the fighter was catapulted into space. Around her, the other pilots formed up in their assigned positions. In the distance, the Zephyrian fleet continued its relentless approach. "This is Raptor 7, she said into her comm. "Beginning reconnaissance approach." What none of them knew was that Sarah Chen had spent years flying into situations where death was the most likely outcome. And she'd learned that sometimes, the best way to complete an impossible mission was to stop thinking like a pilot and start thinking like a weapon. Sarah pushed Raptor 7 to its limits as she approached the Zephyrian formation. The space around her was deceptively peaceful, filled with distant stars and the cold silence of the void. But her instruments told a different story. Energy readings spiked across her displays as the alien ships charged their weapon systems for another volley. "Raptor 7 to base," she transmitted, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I'm getting clear readings on their formation. 12 destroyers in a standard attack pattern, but there's something wrong with their positioning. Define wrong, came Commander Park's voice through the comm. Sarah studied the tactical display, her years of combat experience translating the chaos of battle into recognizable patterns. In Afghanistan, she'd learned to read the landscape, to spot the subtle signs that separated a routine patrol from a carefully planned ambush. The same instincts were screaming warnings now. They're not optimizing for maximum firepower, she reported. The destroyers are spread too wide, and the battlecruiser is hanging back further than necessary. It's like She paused, realization hitting her. They're hurting us. Explain, this isn't their primary force. They're trying to push us toward something. There's another group out there, probably waiting in ambush position. Even as she spoke, Sarah was already changing course, angling Raptor 7 toward the edge of the sensor range. Her modified fighter had better detection capabilities than the standard models, but she was still operating at the limits of what the equipment could handle. Raptor 7, return to defensive position, Park ordered. You're getting too far from support. Negative, Sarah replied, her voice taking on a tone that hadn't been heard since her Black Hawk days. I need to confirm the ambush force before we commit to any defensive strategy. She pushed deeper into space, following her instincts and the faint energy signatures that her sensors were just barely detecting. Behind her, she could hear radio chatter as the other pilots prepared for combat. Davidson and Miller were running final systems checks, their voices tight with nervous energy. Then she found them. Base, this is Raptor 7. I've got confirmation on additional hostiles. Estimate 8 to 10 ships holding position approximately 30,000 kilometers off our starboard flank. They're running silent, but I'm picking up thermal signatures. The tactical situation was worse than anyone had imagined. The Zephyrians weren't just mounting a frontal assault. They were executing a complex pincer movement designed to crush the human convoy between two forces. When the escort frigates moved to engage the primary force, the ambush group would hit them from the side, probably targeting the cargo ships directly. Can you get detailed scans of the ambush force? Park asked. Sarah was already maneuvering for a better angle, using Raptor 7's stealth capabilities to avoid detection. The fighter was designed for reconnaissance, and its advanced sensor package was finally proving its worth. As she closed distance, the enemy ships resolved into clearer detail on her display. I'm seeing heavy cruisers, she reported, at least 3 of them plus escort vessels. Base, this is a full fleet engagement. They're not here to raid our supplies. They're here to eliminate our entire force. The implications were staggering. If the Zephyrians succeeded in destroying this convoy and its escorts, they would have eliminated a significant portion of humanity's defensive capability in this sector. More importantly, they would have proven that human shipping lanes were vulnerable to coordinated attack. Raptor 7, begin your return approach, Park ordered. We need to reformulate our defensive strategy. Sarah was about to acknowledge when her proximity alarm screamed. 3 Zephyrian interceptors had materialized from the void around her, their sleek forms cutting through space like sharks sensing blood. Her reconnaissance mission had been detected. Base, I'm engaged, Sarah transmitted, throwing Raptor 7 into a sharp evasive turn. The enemy interceptors were fast, faster than anything in the human arsenal. But Sarah had advantages they didn't expect. In the mountains of Afghanistan, she'd learned to fly through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate. Valleys so narrow that her rotor wash could trigger rock slides. Approaches so steep that one wrong move would smash her aircraft against stone walls. She'd developed an intuitive understanding of 3-dimensional movement that went beyond normal pilot training. Space was different, but the principles remained the same. Instead of mountains and valleys, she had gravity wells and debris fields. Instead of wind and weather, she had radiation and electromagnetic interference from the nearby ships. Sarah dove toward the ambush fleet, using their own ships as cover against their interceptors. The move was insane by normal standards, deliberately flying into the heart of enemy formation. But it was exactly the kind of calculated risk that had kept her alive in hostile territory. What the hell is she doing? Davidson's voice crackled over the comm. Surviving, Park replied grimly, watching the tactical display as Sarah's fighter weaved between enemy ships. The Zephyrian interceptors followed, but they were constrained by their own fleet's positioning. They couldn't fire freely without risking hits on their own ships. Sarah exploited this hesitation, using the bulk of a heavy cruiser to break line of sight before accelerating hard toward open space. But the maneuver came at a cost. Her fighter's stealth systems had been compromised by the high-energy evasive maneuvers, and now every enemy ship in the area knew exactly where she was. Weapons fire began tracking her position, filling the space around Raptor 7 with deadly energy beams. Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always come over her in combat. Time seemed to slow as her training took over. She could see the firing patterns of the enemy weapons, could predict where the next volley would go. It was like flying through flak over hostile territory, except the stakes were even higher. "Raptor 7 to base," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I've got full tactical intelligence on both enemy forces. Transmitting data now." She sent the complete sensor records to the Perseus, giving the human fleet their first clear picture of what they were facing. It was worse than they'd feared, but at least now they could plan accordingly. "Excellent work, Raptor 7. Park's voice came through, tight with professional admiration. "Now get out of there." Sarah was trying to do exactly that, but the Zephyrian interceptors had regrouped and were closing fast. Her fighter was faster in a straight line, but they had the advantage of numbers and position. She needed something more than speed to escape. Looking at her tactical display, Sarah made a decision that would have terrified any sane pilot. Instead of running directly back toward the human fleet, she angled toward the primary Zephyrian force, the one that everyone knew was coming. "She's lost her mind," Miller's voice came over the comm. But Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. She'd done it before in the mountains of Afghanistan, when enemy forces thought they had her trapped. Sometimes the best escape route was directly through the enemy, especially when they weren't expecting it. As she approached the main Zephyrian fleet, Sarah began broadcasting on multiple frequencies, using every trick she'd learned about electronic warfare. She flooded their communications with noise, disrupted their targeting systems, and generally made herself the most annoying target in local space. The enemy fleet began to reorient toward her, pulling ships out of their attack formation to deal with the single fighter that was somehow causing chaos throughout their carefully planned assault. It was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. "All units," she transmitted to the human fleet, "recommend immediate attack on primary force. Their formation is disrupted, and they're focusing on me instead of you. You've got maybe 5 minutes before they reorganize." It was a desperate gambit, using herself as bait to give the rest of the fleet a chance. But it was also exactly the kind of mission she'd trained for years ago, in a different war against a different enemy. Sarah Chen was no longer thinking like a supply specialist or even like a normal pilot. She was thinking like a Black Hawk pilot, someone trained to fly into impossible situations and somehow find a way to complete the mission. Commander Park watched her tactical display with a mixture of admiration and horror, as Sarah's fighter danced through the Zephyrian fleet like a leaf in a hurricane. The young woman was somehow staying alive against impossible odds, but more importantly, she was right about the opportunity her distraction had created. "All fighters, immediate attack run on the primary force," Park ordered. "Target their destroyers first. We need to thin their numbers before they can reorganize." The Perseus and Titan's Edge began their attack approach, their weapons systems charging as they closed distance with the confused Zephyrian fleet. Davidson and Miller fell into formation with the other pilots, their earlier nervousness replaced by grim determination. Meanwhile, Sarah was learning that space combat had some significant differences from atmospheric flying. There was no terrain to use for cover, no gravity to help with sudden course changes, and no atmosphere to provide the subtle feedback that experienced pilots used to judge their aircraft's performance. But there were other advantages. Her fighter's fuel consumption was minimal in the vacuum of space, allowing for sustained high-energy maneuvers that would have been impossible in atmosphere. The lack of air resistance meant she could change direction in ways that would have torn apart any aircraft she'd flown before. "Raptor 7, your thermal signature is spiking," came Park's voice through the comm. "You're pushing your engines too hard." Sarah glanced at her engine displays. The commander was right. The constant high-G maneuvers were putting enormous stress on the fighter systems. But she'd learned long ago that sometimes you had to break equipment to save lives. "Understood," she replied. "But I'm not done yet." She was studying the Zephyrian battle cruiser, the massive ship that had been hanging back from the main engagement. It was easily 3 times the size of the largest human vessel, bristling with weapons and armor. More importantly, it was the command center for the entire enemy operation. In Afghanistan, Sarah had learned that sometimes the best way to end a firefight was to eliminate the enemy's command structure. Cut off the head and the body would follow. The same principle might apply here. "Base, what's the weapons loadout on this fighter?" she asked. "Standard interceptor package," Park replied. 2 plasma cannons and a complement of guided missiles. "Why?" Sarah was already running calculations in her head. The battlecruiser's armor was too heavy for her light weapons to penetrate under normal circumstances. But there were always weak points, especially on ships that large. Sensor arrays, communication equipment, docking bays. "I'm going to attempt to disable their command ship," she announced. "Negative." Park's voice was sharp with alarm. "Raptor 7, you are not authorized for an attack run on a battlecruiser. Return to defensive formation immediately." But Sarah was already committing to her approach, using the chaos of the ongoing battle to mask her intentions. The Zephyrian destroyers were engaged with the human frigates, their attention focused on the larger threat. The interceptors that had been chasing her were caught between pursuing her and rejoining their fleet's defense. She approached the battlecruiser from below, using its own bulk to shield her from most of its weapon systems. The ship was enormous up close, its hull stretching away in all directions like a metal landscape. Sarah could see the subtle variations in armor plating, the slight gaps where different sections met, the technological vulnerabilities that every warship carried. Her targeting system locked onto a cluster of sensor arrays near the battlecruiser's forward section. If she could disable those systems, she might be able to blind the enemy fleet's coordination capabilities. "Raptor 7, abort your attack run," Park ordered. "That's a direct order." Sarah's finger hesitated over the firing control. She'd spent years following orders, trusting in the chain of command and the wisdom of her superiors. But she'd also learned that sometimes orders came from people who weren't in the cockpit, who couldn't see what the pilot could see. "I'm sorry, Commander," she said quietly, "but I can see a shot." She fired both plasma cannons in a sustained burst, targeting the sensor cluster with surgical precision. The beam struck home, sending cascades of sparks across the battlecruiser's hull as critical systems overloaded and failed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every weapon on the battlecruiser that could track her position opened fire simultaneously. The space around Raptor 7 became a storm of energy beams and explosive projectiles. Sarah threw her fighter into the most extreme, evasive maneuvers she'd ever attempted, using every trick she'd learned in 3 years of combat flying. She flew patterns that seemed to defy physics, changing direction in ways that pushed her fighter's structural limits and left her on the edge of consciousness from the G-forces. But there was too much incoming fire. Even with her skill and her fighter's capabilities, she couldn't avoid everything. A glancing blow from a plasma beam sent her spinning, alarms screaming as multiple systems went offline. "Raptor 7, report." Park's voice came through the static-filled comm. "I'm hit," Sarah replied, fighting to regain control of her damaged fighter. "Lost maneuvering thrusters and primary sensors." But the attack was successful. "Their sensor array is down." It was true. The battlecruiser was firing blind now, its weapons tracking roughly toward her position but without the precision that modern targeting systems provided. More importantly, the entire Zephyrian fleet was starting to show signs of coordination breakdown as their command ship struggled to maintain communication links. "Raptor 7, can you make it back to the fleet?" Park asked. Sarah checked her system status. The picture wasn't good. Her main engines were functioning, but barely, and her life support was showing yellow warning indicators. More critically, her fighter's structural integrity was compromised. One more hit from anything larger than small arms fire would probably tear the aircraft apart. "Negative," she replied. "I'm not going to make it back." She could hear the frustration in Park's voice when the commander responded. "Raptor 7, do not attempt any further heroics. Find somewhere to lay low until we can extract you." But Sarah was looking at her tactical display, noting the position of the Zephyrian ambush fleet. They were beginning to move now, taking advantage of the chaos in the main battle to position themselves for their planned attack on the cargo ships. In a few minutes, they would be in optimal firing position, and the human convoy would be caught in a crossfire they couldn't survive. She thought about the cargo holds full of medical supplies and food, about the colonies that would starve without this delivery, about the civilian families who had trusted the Colonial Defense Force to protect them. She thought about her dead co-pilot from that mission in Afghanistan, about the soldiers she'd failed to save when her helicopter went down. "Commander," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos around her, "I need you to do something for me." "Raptor 7, whatever you're thinking." "I need you to tell them who I really am," Sarah interrupted. "After this is over, I need you to tell them that I was Captain Sarah Chen, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. I flew Blackhawks in Afghanistan from 2019 to 2022. I want them to know that I wasn't just a supply specialist." Park's voice was quiet when she responded. "What are you planning, Captain?" Sarah was already changing course, angling toward the ambush fleet with her damaged fighter. Her weapons were depleted, her systems were failing, but she still had one weapon left. She had momentum, and she had the kind of determination that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. "I'm going to complete the mission," she said simply. In the distance, the Zephyrian ambush fleet continued its approach, unaware that a damaged human fighter was on an intercept course. They had no way of knowing that its pilot had spent years flying into situations where death was the most likely outcome, and that she'd never failed to complete a mission when lives were depending on her. Sarah Chen checked her fighter's velocity and trajectory one final time, then cut all communications with the human fleet. What she was about to do didn't require orders or authorization. It just required the kind of courage that had always defined humanity's finest warriors. Captain Elena Vasquez felt the Meridian's hope shudder as another Zephyrian plasma volley struck their shields. The cargo ship's defensive systems were never designed for this kind of sustained bombardment, and warning lights across her bridge told the story of rapidly failing protection. "Shield strength down to 30%, reported Lieutenant Commander Chen. "At this rate, we've got maybe 10 minutes before they punch through." Elena watched the tactical display with growing desperation. The two escort frigates were fighting valiantly, but they were severely outgunned. The Perseus had managed to destroy 2 Zephyrian destroyers, but at the cost of significant damage to her own weapon systems. The Titan's Edge was limping on auxiliary power after taking a direct hit to her engine section. "Captain," Torres called from communications, "I'm picking up transmissions from Commander Park. Something about the pilot who went on reconnaissance. She's identified a second enemy fleet." Elena's blood went cold. "A second fleet?" "Yes, ma'am. Apparently they're in position to attack us from our starboard flank. The whole engagement is a trap." As if summoned by his words, new contacts appeared on the tactical display. 8 heavy ships emerged from behind a debris field, their weapons already charged and targeting the cargo vessels. Elena realized with crystal clarity that they were all about to die. "All ships emergency evasive maneuvers," she ordered, though she knew it was futile. Cargo ships weren't built for combat maneuvering, and the enemy had positioned themselves perfectly to eliminate any escape routes. The lead Zephyrian cruiser from the ambush fleet fired first, its plasma cannon sending a brilliant beam of destruction toward the Meridian's hope. Elena braced for impact, knowing that her ship's remaining shields wouldn't be enough to stop a direct hit from a weapon that size. The impact never came. Instead, a small fighter streaked across the path of the plasma beam, absorbing the entire energy discharge in a brilliant flash of light. The fighter was vaporized instantly, but its sacrifice had saved the cargo ship. "What the hell was that?" Chen demanded, studying his sensor readings. Elena stared at the tactical display, understanding flooding through her. "That was Raptor 7. The reconnaissance pilot just saved our lives. But the sacrifice had been more than just a single act of heroism." Elena watched as confusion rippled through the Zephyrian ambush fleet. Their carefully planned attack had been disrupted by something they hadn't anticipated. A human willing to die to protect others. "Ma'am," Torres said urgently, "I'm detecting massive energy signatures from the edge of the system. Something big is coming out of hyperspace." Elena felt a surge of hope. "Reinforcements?" "I think so. Multiple contacts, heavy signatures. Looks like a full battle group." The tactical display updated as new ships materialized from hyperspace. 3 heavy cruisers, 6 destroyers, and a carrier that Elena recognized as the Indomitable, flagship of the Third Fleet. It was the largest concentration of human military power she'd ever seen in one place. "This is Admiral Catherine Hayes aboard the Indomitable," came a voice over the communication system. "All civilian vessels maintain current position. Military vessels prepare for coordinated assault on enemy forces." Elena slumped in her command chair, relief washing over her. But her joy was tempered by the knowledge that someone had died to give them this chance. The quiet young woman who'd volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. Meanwhile, aboard the Perseus, Commander Park was trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Her instruments had recorded the final moments of Raptor 7, and the readings were almost impossible to believe. "Flight control," she called to her technical staff. "Analyze the sensor data from Raptor 7's final approach. I need to understand what just happened." Senior Chief Martinez, her head of flight operations, looked up from his console with an expression of amazement. "Commander, according to our readings, she didn't just intercept that plasma beam. She deliberately positioned her fighter to absorb maximum energy while creating an electromagnetic pulse effect." "Explain." "She overloaded her fighter's power systems deliberately, then used the explosion to create a localized EMP burst. It scrambled the targeting systems on at least 3 enemy ships." "Ma'am, that wasn't just a suicide run. That was a precisely calculated tactical strike." Park stared at the data, understanding dawning on her. Captain Sarah Chen hadn't just died to save the convoy. She died to give the incoming reinforcements a tactical advantage. The Zephyrian ambush fleet was blind and confused. Perfect targets for the arriving human battle group. "Get me Admiral Hayes," Park ordered. The screen flickered to life, showing the weather-beaten face of one of humanity's most respected military commanders. Admiral Hayes was in her 60s, a veteran of every major engagement in the war against the Zephyrians. "Commander Park," Hayes said without preamble, "I understand you've had a challenging day." "Yes, ma'am. But I need to report on the actions of one of our pilots. Captain Sarah Chen, flying as Raptor 7, conducted reconnaissance that identified the enemy's battle plan and then executed a strike that disabled their coordination systems." Hayes's eyebrows rose slightly. "Captain Chen? I don't have a Captain Chen on my pilot rosters." "That's because she wasn't officially a pilot, ma'am. According to her records, she was a supply specialist assigned to the Meridian's Hope. But she had military flight experience." "What kind of experience?" Park hesitated, then decided that the full truth was owed to Sarah's memory. "She claimed to be from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Black Hawk pilot, Afghanistan deployment." Admiral Hayes was quiet for a long moment. The 160th SOAR was legendary within military circles, known for impossible missions and the kind of pilots who could fly through hell itself. But their operations had been classified far above Park's clearance level. "Commander," Hayes said finally, "I'm going to share something with you that's above your normal classification level. 3 years ago, we had an incident involving a 160th pilot whose background couldn't be verified through normal channels. The pilot in question had skills that suggested Black Ops training, but the records were either classified or non-existent. What happened to them? They were quietly transferred to the Colonial Supply Service rather than face an investigation that might have compromised ongoing operations. The assumption was that they would serve out their time quietly and cause no further problems." Park felt pieces clicking into place. Sarah Chen. If that was her real name, then yes. "Commander, what you're telling me is that one of our most experienced special operations pilots spent the last 3 years moving cargo containers between planets, and when the moment came, she remembered her training. The implications were staggering. Sarah hadn't just been a supply specialist who happened to have some flight experience. She'd been one of the most elite pilots in human military history, hidden away in the supply corps because her background was too sensitive for normal military service." "Admiral," Park said quietly, "she saved everyone. The convoy, the escort ships, everyone. And she did it with a level of tactical precision that I've never seen before." "That sounds like a 160th pilot," Hayes replied. "They were trained for exactly this kind of mission." "Impossible odds, civilian lives at stake, and no backup coming." As they spoke, the Third Fleet was systematically destroying the confused Zephyrian forces. The ambush fleet, blinded by Sarah's final strike, was picked apart by precise long-range fire. The main enemy force, already damaged by the earlier engagement, was quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Within an hour, the battle was over. The convoy was safe, the enemy fleet was destroyed, and humanity had won a significant victory. But Park couldn't stop thinking about the quiet young woman who'd made it all possible. "Admiral," she said, "I'd like to recommend Captain Chen for the Medal of Honor." Hayes nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do. But Commander, I want you to understand something. There are probably dozens of people like Sarah Chen scattered throughout our military. People whose backgrounds are too sensitive for normal service but whose skills are exactly what we need in this war. What do you mean? I mean that the Colonial Defense Force is about to start asking some very different questions about recruitment and background checks. If we have elite operators working as supply specialists and maintenance technicians, we need to find them and put their skills to proper use. Park understood. Sarah Chen's sacrifice had saved the convoy, but her story might also save the entire war effort by helping humanity find and utilize its hidden warriors. As the Third Fleet escorted the convoy toward its destination, Park stood in the observation deck of the Perseus looking out at the stars. Somewhere in that vast darkness, the wreckage of Raptor 7 was tumbling through space, carrying with it the remains of a woman who'd been much more than she'd appeared to be. Black Hawk pilot, Park murmured to herself. She really was the real deal. 6 months after the Battle of Meridian's Hope, Admiral Catherine Hayes stood before the Colonial Defense Council in their secure briefing chamber on Luna Base. The room was filled with the highest-ranking officers in human space, all gathered to hear the results of what had become known as the Hidden Warrior Initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, Hayes began, activating a holographic display that showed personnel records from across the Colonial Defense Force. What we've discovered is both troubling and extraordinary. The display showed hundreds of files, each marked with classification levels that made most of the assembled officers uncomfortable. Names, faces, and service records of people who had been hiding in plain sight throughout the human military. When we began investigating the background of Captain Sarah Chen, we uncovered a network of former Special Operations personnel who had been quietly transferred to non-combat roles due to classified background issues. These individuals represent some of the most skilled and experienced warriors in human history. General Morrison, commanding officer of the Fourth Fleet, leaned forward in his chair. How many are we talking about, Admiral? As of this morning, we've identified 347 individuals currently serving in various support roles who have elite combat experience that was previously unknown to their commanding officers. Engineers who used to be demolitions experts, communications specialists who were former intelligence operatives, and supply personnel who were once the most dangerous pilots in human space. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Hayes continued, bringing up specific examples on the holographic display. Consider Master Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez, currently assigned as a maintenance supervisor on the orbital shipyard at Titan. His records show standard technical training and 15 years of exemplary service. What his records don't show is that he spent 5 years as a combat engineer with the Army Rangers, specializing in urban warfare and explosive ordnance disposal. Another file appeared. Or Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos, listed as a communications officer aboard the heavy cruiser Devastator. Her classified background includes 3 years with Naval Special Warfare, conducting deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. Hayes paused, letting the information sink in before continuing. The common thread among all these individuals is that their backgrounds were too sensitive for normal military service. Black operations, classified missions, plausible deniability situations. When budget cuts and political changes ended their programs, they were quietly transferred to support roles rather than discharged entirely. Admiral Park, who had been promoted following her actions during the Battle of Meridian's Hope, spoke up. What's their current status? Are they willing to return to combat roles? Hayes smiled grimly. That's where it gets interesting. When we approached these individuals and explained the situation, 93% of them volunteered immediately for combat reassignment. They've been waiting years for the chance to use their real skills again. She activated another display, showing training facility statistics. We've established a special retraining program at the Phobos Combat Center. These aren't raw recruits learning basic skills. These are experienced warriors learning to apply their expertise to new technologies and battlefield conditions. The results were spectacular. Former Rangers were adapting to zero-gravity combat operations in record time. Ex-Navy SEALs were becoming expert pilots in space-based fighter craft. Intelligence operatives were developing new tactics for electronic warfare against Zephyrian communication systems. The program has exceeded our most optimistic projections, Hayes continued. Average training time has been reduced by 60%, and combat effectiveness ratings are the highest we've ever recorded. More importantly, these individuals understand something that many of our regular troops don't: how to operate independently under extreme pressure. General Morrison nodded thoughtfully, like Captain Chen did during the Meridian battle. Exactly. These warriors don't need constant supervision or detailed orders. They assess situations, make decisions, and execute missions based on years of experience in the most dangerous environments human forces have ever operated in. Hayes brought up a new display showing recent combat operations. In the past 4 months, units incorporating these rediscovered special operations personnel have achieved a mission success rate of 97%, compared to 63% for standard units. Enemy casualties have increased dramatically, while friendly casualties have dropped to their lowest levels since the war began. But the most significant development wasn't just the combat effectiveness. It was the impact on morale and tactical innovation throughout the entire Colonial Defense Force. These individuals are natural teachers, Hayes explained. They're sharing knowledge and techniques that were previously limited to elite units. Standard infantry squads are learning urban combat tactics developed in Earth's most dangerous conflicts. Fighter pilots are adopting evasive maneuvers perfected in atmospheric combat zones. Engineers are applying field-expedient solutions that can keep equipment running under impossible conditions. Admiral Park leaned back in her chair, thinking about Sarah Chen and the way she'd approached the tactical situation during the battle. Are we looking at a fundamental change in how we structure our military? That's exactly what we're looking at, Hayes confirmed. The traditional model of separating elite special operations forces from regular military units was designed for conflicts where we had overwhelming numerical superiority. Against the Zephyrians, we need every soldier to have the skills and mindset of a special operator. She brought up a final display showing projected force structures for the next phase of the war. We're proposing to integrate these rediscovered warriors throughout the fleet as squad leaders, technical specialists, and tactical advisors. Instead of concentrating elite skills in a few units, we're distributing that expertise across the entire force. The implications were revolutionary. Every ship, every station, every combat unit would have personnel with elite training and combat experience. The Zephyrians would find themselves facing an enemy that was suddenly much more dangerous and unpredictable than before. There's one more thing, Hayes said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. We've been analyzing the psychological profiles of these individuals, trying to understand what drove them to volunteer for such dangerous reassignments after years of quiet service. She paused, looking around the room at the assembled officers. What we found is that they never stopped being warriors. They were just waiting for the opportunity to serve again. Captain Chen spent 3 years moving cargo containers, but she never stopped being a Black Hawk pilot. When the moment came, she did what she'd always been trained to do: complete the mission, regardless of the cost. General Morrison stood up, speaking for the assembled officers. Admiral, what do you need from us to make this program successful? Complete support for unconventional tactics and command structures, Hayes replied. These warriors don't always follow standard procedures because they've learned that standard procedures don't work in desperate situations. They need commanders who understand that sometimes the best course of action looks like insubordination to people who've never been in combat. She thought about Commander Park's report on Sarah Chen's final mission, how the young pilot had disobeyed direct orders because she could see tactical opportunities that weren't visible from the command center. More than anything, we need to remember that war isn't about following rules. It's about winning. And these individuals know how to win against impossible odds. Captain Chen proved that when she saved the Meridian convoy. Now we have 346 more like her, ready to do whatever it takes to protect humanity. As the briefing concluded and the officers began discussing implementation details, Hayes remained at the podium, looking at the holographic display of personnel files. Each name represented years of hidden service, skills that had been wasted and potential that was finally being recognized. Sarah Chen's sacrifice had done more than save a convoy. It had revealed an entire hidden army of elite warriors scattered throughout the Colonial Defense Force, waiting for their chance to fight again. The Zephyrians were about to discover that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't advanced technology or numerical superiority. It was the quiet courage of individuals who refused to give up. No matter how desperate the situation became, 2 years after the Battle of Meridian's Hope, the war against the Zephyrians had transformed into something unrecognizable from its early days. The aliens who had once pushed deep into human territory with coordinated fleet actions now found themselves fighting a very different kind of enemy. Captain Elena Vasquez, now commanding the assault cruiser Sarah Chen, named in honor of the pilot who had saved her convoy, watched the tactical display as her ship approached the Zephyrian stronghold at Kepler 442. What should have been a standard planetary assault had become something much more sophisticated. Ghost. Team is in position, reported her communications officer. They've disabled the orbital defense platforms without triggering any alarms. Elena nodded, unsurprised by the efficiency. Ghost Team was led by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the former Army Ranger who had been working as a maintenance supervisor until the Hidden Warrior Initiative found him. His team consisted entirely of rediscovered special operations personnel, and their mission capabilities were unlike anything the Zephyrians had encountered before. Phantom Squadron reports all fighter patrols neutralized. Came another update. Enemy forces remain unaware of our presence. Phantom Squadron was commanded by Major Lisa Park, formerly Commander Park of the Perseus. Her promotion had come with command of the most unusual fighter unit in the Colonial Defense Force. 24 pilots, all of whom had been found in non-combat roles despite having elite flying experience. They flew modified fighters equipped with stealth technology and unconventional weapon systems. Elena studied the planetary scan data. The Zephyrian base was heavily fortified, with underground bunkers and overlapping defensive systems that would have made a frontal assault extremely costly. But frontal assaults were no longer the human way of warfare. Signal the ground teams, she ordered. Begin infiltration phase. What happened next would have been impossible 2 years earlier. Instead of landing massive assault forces and fighting through prepared defensive positions, small teams of human warriors began materializing throughout the Zephyrian base. They used tunnels that shouldn't have existed, approaches that defied conventional military doctrine, and tactics that had been developed in Earth's most dangerous conflicts. Lieutenant Commander Santos, the former Naval Special Warfare operative, led her team through the base's communication center. Moving with the silent efficiency of a predator, they disabled alien communication systems and began feeding false information to Zephyrian commanders. Meanwhile, Sergeant First Class Williams, who had spent 3 years working in the Quartermaster Corps, was demonstrating why he had once been considered one of the most dangerous snipers in human military history. From positions that seemed impossible to reach, he began systematically eliminating key enemy personnel with weapons that fired no sound and left no trace. The Zephyrians found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Communications systems failed at critical moments. Guard posts went silent without explanation. Critical equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested sabotage, but showed no evidence of human presence. Elena, came Major Park's voice over the comm. We're seeing massive confusion in their defensive coordination. Whatever the ground teams are doing, it's working. Elena watched the tactical display as the alien defensive network began to collapse from within. This wasn't the sledgehammer approach that human forces had used in the early days of the war. This was surgery, performed by warriors who understood that the best victories were achieved without the enemy ever understanding what had happened to them. All teams. Report status, she requested. Ghost Team has secured the primary command center, Rodriguez reported. Zephyrian commanders are being held for interrogation. No human casualties. Wraith Team has disabled their planetary shield generators, came another voice. Defense network is down across the entire hemisphere. Spectre Team has secured the orbital shipyard facilities. Enemy vessels are being prepared for capture rather than destruction. Elena shook her head in amazement. 2 years ago, this operation would have required a full fleet assault. Massive casualties and months of preparation. Now a single cruiser and fewer than 200 personnel had captured an entire enemy stronghold in less than 6 hours. The transformation hadn't been limited to tactics and personnel. The entire philosophy of human warfare had changed. Instead of trying to match Zephyrian technology and numerical advantages, human forces had embraced the principles that Sarah Chen had demonstrated during her final mission: adaptability, individual initiative, and the willingness to take calculated risks that confused and demoralized the enemy. Captain, her science officer reported, we're receiving intelligence downloads from the captured command center. The Zephyrians have been developing new weapon systems specifically designed to counter our previous tactics. Elena smiled grimly. Too bad we're not using those tactics anymore, it was true. The aliens had spent enormous resources developing countermeasures for human frontal assaults, numerical superiority, and conventional fleet actions. They had been preparing to fight the war as it had existed 2 years ago, not as it had evolved. "Ma'am," the communications officer called out. "We're receiving a priority transmission from Admiral Hayes." The screen flickered to life, showing the Admiral aboard her flagship. Behind her, Elena could see the bustle of a major fleet operation in progress. "Captain Vasquez," Hayes said without preamble. "Excellent work on the Kepler operation. Your mission success has cleared the way for Phase 7 of Operation Restoration." Elena felt a surge of excitement. Operation Restoration was humanity's plan to retake every system that had been lost to Zephyrian expansion. It was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible, but the successes of the past 2 years had made the impossible seem merely difficult. "What's our next assignment, Admiral?" "You're going home, Captain. The Sarah Chen has been selected to lead the liberation of Earth." Elena felt her breath catch. Earth had been under Zephyrian occupation for 18 months, its population enslaved and its resources stripped to support the alien war machine. Every human in space had dreamed of the day they would return to reclaim humanity's homeworld. "Admiral, are we ready for that kind of operation?" Hayes's expression was confident. "Captain, 18 months ago, the Zephyrians conquered Earth because they faced a human military that fought like them. Massive fleets, conventional tactics, predictable strategies. Tomorrow they're going to face something they've never encountered before, an entire planet's population that's been taught to fight like Sarah Chen." The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. The underground resistance movements on Earth hadn't been sitting idle during the occupation. They had been learning, adapting, and preparing. More importantly, they had been taught by the same hidden warriors who had transformed the Colonial Defense Force. "The liberation of Earth won't be a conquest, Captain," Hayes continued. "It will be a demonstration. We're going to show the Zephyrians what happens when they try to occupy a world full of humans who refuse to surrender." As the transmission ended, Elena looked around her bridge at the crew of the Sarah Chen. Many of them were part of the Hidden Warrior Initiative, former Special Operations personnel who had spent years in quiet support roles. Others were regular military who had been trained by those elite warriors, learning tactics and mindsets that had been developed in Earth's most dangerous conflicts. "All hands," she announced over the ship's communication system. "This is the captain. We've just received orders to participate in the liberation of Earth. For those of you who were born there, we're going home. For those of you who weren't, you're about to see why humanity never gives up." She paused, thinking about Sarah Chen and the quiet courage that had started this transformation. 2 years ago, a supply specialist sacrificed her life to save a convoy. Today, that sacrifice is about to liberate a world. That's what happens when you underestimate humans who look ordinary, but carry the hearts of warriors. As the Sarah Chen prepared to jump to hyperspace, Elena reflected on how much had changed since that desperate battle at Meridian's Hope. The Zephyrians had conquered Earth expecting to face a broken, demoralized enemy. Instead, they were about to discover that sometimes the quiet ones were the most dangerous of all. Sarah Chen had been gone for 2 years, but her legacy lived on in every human warrior who refused to give up, in every impossible mission that somehow succeeded, and in every enemy who learned too late that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their absolute refusal to surrender, no matter how desperate the situation became.